just another couple of minutes. I don't want to be too Swiss about starting on time, but some people are just coming in. I think we're now good. Okay, I get the thumbs up from the back room. Very warm welcome to everyone here in the room today on this cold November day. It's a pleasure to have you here. We're a rather intimate round. My name is Dorothy Baumann-Pauli. I'm a professor at the Geneva School for Economics and Management, where I direct the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. This is our banner. It's a new institution here in Geneva. We launched our center in 2019, so 2 years ago, at around the same time then the first Building Bridges event took place. And at the time, I watched this first Building Bridges event from the sidelines, and I noticed that the sustainable finance conversation is almost exclusively green. And launching the Center for Business and Human Rights, I thought, if there is ever a Building Bridges event again, I want to make sure that human rights are on the agenda. So I'm very happy that we can have this session this time in the context of Building Bridges, entitled Beyond Green, Integrating Human Rights in the Sustainable Finance Agenda. At the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, we are looking at human rights challenges in different industry sectors. Finance is one, but we also have work streams on agriculture, fashion, and the extractive sector with a focus on cobalt. Feel free to check out our work on our website, gcbhr.org. Today, I'm very happy to partner with the Thun Group of Banks. The Thun Group of Banks launched in 2011, and I don't want to introduce them because they will introduce themselves and I will ask them a lot of questions about their work. But I will introduce my panelists. On the left, I have Dr. Christian Leitz. He's the head of corporate responsibility and a corporate historian at the UBS Bank. Also, he's the co-chair of the Thun Group. On my right, I have Raoul Manjarin. He's a senior specialist, sustainability risk at Credit Suisse, and the co-head of the Thun Group's Outreach Working Group. Susie Bullock, who's joining us from the UK. You can see her on the screen. She's the co-chair of Transnational Litigation Practice Group and ESG Practice, advisor to the Thun Group and a partner at Gibson and Dunn. Thank you, Susie, for joining us from abroad. She was thinking until last minute whether or not to travel to Geneva. Given the new rules, you were better advised to stay in the UK. For people in the room, it's advised to keep your masks on. Since we're far away from you and we have a distance, we can take our masks off. So this is one of the few sessions at Building Bridges that has no live stream. So that's why I said it's a rather intimate round. But the session will be recorded. So also people who cannot join today will be able to enjoy it later. With this, I want to start with a number of questions to my panelists. We will run for about 45 minutes, and then I really want to engage with you, with the audience, to raise more questions. And I clustered the questions around sort of 3 themes. First, I want to give the panelists the chance to introduce their group, the Thun Group of Banks. The patron of the Building Bridges event, Monsieur Patrick Audier, just a few months ago told us that he wasn't fully aware that the Thun Group still exists. However, the Thun Group has done fantastic work for the past 10 years, and now is the time for them to present some of the work that they've done. So first we'll talk about the Thun Group and their work, and then we want to broaden it up a bit about generally the finance sector and human rights. And then in the last bit, I'm keen to hear from the experts here how they see the future of human rights in sustainable finance. But first, Christian, I'll start with you, because I don't want to make you or myself sound old, but I interviewed Christian about 15 years ago in the context of my PhD thesis about the UN Global Compact that the UBS co-founded, actually. He was one of the co-founding companies. And you were also part of the Thun Group from day one. So You're also a historian, so give us the history. Let us know how this Thun Group formed, why it formed, and who's currently part of it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for the kind introduction. It's always dangerous to ask a historian to talk about history, you know. Can we sort of look at the watch? It's probably going to take another 1.5 hours. It's actually interesting. I mean, the first time I had this pleasure of being in Geneva on the topic of human rights was on the one day, and I think we need to remind ourselves, on the very one day that John Ruggie, bless him, and his team, you know, did look at the financial sector. You know, it's exactly one day in the whole process that led up to the UNGPs. We just got to remind ourselves of that. And just to provide you with a contrast, it was, I think, 60, at least from what I remember, what John told me, it was like 65 days for the mining sector, you know. So one day for the financial sector, 65 days for the mining sector, which to me is, you know, we can discuss that, is fully correct, you know. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But of course, if you tell that people today, sort of 12, 13 years later, they look at you in bewilderment because they, you know, would put financial sector sometimes ahead of the mining sector, which is an interesting observation, you know. But so in a sense, you know, that's my first observation, you know. So the financial sector was nowhere in the focus of the development of the UNGPs. Number two observation, the UNGPs, I think just to remind ourselves, the UN Guiding Principles are not sector specific, you know. They don't give you any guidance on what you're supposed to do in a particular sector, you know. It doesn't tell you how to behave as a bank or an asset manager or an insurance company, of course, or other sectors. That's not what the UNGPs are about. So I think that's critical to remember, because quite often, you know, people talk very simply about, okay, let's just embed the UNGPs in the work of a sector. Well, you know, look at the UNGPs. It's not how they're written, you know, that's not the purpose of the UNGPs. So the third point, clearly, and that's to the question, is, of course, what we then did is to really think about, okay, this needs to be translated into the language and the processes of banking, you know, to make sense. And that's how, very simply, you know, put, of course, you could put a lot more detail to it, that's how the Thun Group started. And we were actually, and I think that was quite surprised, and maybe for some stakeholders a bit of you know, kind of an interesting one. I put it like in the British sense, Susie, you know, sort of an interesting observation that the banks were actually first in doing that kind of translation work, you know. And so essentially what we did is to follow the process. You know, the UNGPs, as you all know, were published in the summer of 2011. We had our first meeting in that nice little town of Thun, you know. So just very simply, you know, at the UBS Conference Center in Thun. So we decided, okay, we need a name, and we picked the name of the place that we met. Actually, there is an interesting context here, because, of course, well, at least for somebody working for UBS, you know, there's a bit of a deliberate notion here, which is there's long been a Wolfsburg Group, you know, which is the other UBS Conference Center on the shores of Lake Constance. And that has been dealing with the whole topic of anti-money laundering and related topics of combating financial crime since 1999, 2000, you know, so just to put the topic into context. And the very first paper, the very first meeting in Thun was actually from somebody from the Wolfsburg Group, talking about how they approached their topic from an industry's perspective. So clearly our notion, our sense was, okay, let's translate this into the banking sector. Let's create some understanding of what the UNGPs mean. Let's help each other in understanding it, you know, so helping each other in terms of the banks that were there. And of course, let's also help people to embed it in the processes within the banks that were there, you know, or are still part of the discussion. And I think that's sort of at the core of what we still keep doing, which is really, you know, trying to make sure that what is the UNGPs, and actually now I would say beyond the UNGPs, and we can come back to that discussion later on. What does that mean for a bank? What does it mean for the policies that a bank needs, the due diligence processes, and so on? And that's really what we've done over the years, and that we've looked at over the years, and that's how the banks that are involved, of course, worked on the basis of those very conversations. So there are regular meetings, well, of course, now there are regular calls, more than meetings or online meetings. We have an annual meeting where we also bring together different stakeholders, so we've had interesting conversations, and maybe we can come back to that later on in terms of the discussions that we've had. But that is, in a nutshell, at the core of what we do. I mean, just one last comment, of course, this is happening right at the time that the UN Forum is happening. And maybe this is for the later discussion. I've not ever seen the UN Forum being so low key. And I don't think that's just because of Corona. So maybe there's an interesting one. When I look back 10 years ago, we had a very, very strong discussion around business in this case, banking and human rights. I can't remember a single stakeholder at the time, which is kind of ironic, that came with the topic of climate. Climate was there, but people still talked a lot more about the environment. There's a much, much stronger discussion about human rights. So actually, as something that we could talk about later on, it's interesting how this has changed quite substantially over those 10 years and what that actually means for the future of that human rights discussion.
Thank you, Christian. I want to know more, but just for the audience, he's talking about the UN Forum for Business and Human Rights, which is the biggest global event for this business human rights field, which takes place annually here in Geneva at the UN. But of course, the past 2 years, it's been just an online event, and this year, certainly a slimmed-down version. And I hear your disappointment, Christian, but we'll now take the enthusiasm here and maybe to other forums to figure out the very commendable objective of the Thun Group, namely to define in concrete terms what does this commitment to human rights due diligence, which is the core concept and the UN guiding principles, actually mean for companies that operate in concrete industry contexts and, in this case, that operate in the banking sector. Let me now turn to Susie. Susie, you've joined the group in 2016, and you worked prior at the UBS. So you've been following the work from the beginning as well. Tell us a bit more about the group and how you've experienced the work in the group in the past 5 years and, the concrete outputs you've produced as a group.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dora, and thank you all for having me. And I'm sorry not to be there in person. Yeah, you're quite right. So I joined the Thun Group in 2016 at a time when I was working within UBS as a lawyer and litigator, and was sort of seeking out opportunities to, really use my skills in a business and human rights context. And I was fortunate to come across Christian and work with Christian, and then join as a sort of part of the UBS delegation with the Thun Group. So although I wasn't there at the inception, I was certainly at the group, with the group in the early-ish stages when, as Christian says, the focus was very firmly on the UN guiding principles. And again, as Christian explained, really how that translates into practical terms for the banks. It's one thing to talk about conceptually the requirement to undertake due diligence, but what that means in practice for those in the day-to-day role sitting within the bank, undertaking due diligence, risk mapping, whatever it might be, there's that needs work, that needs translation and careful thought, and that's what the Thun Group was really engaged in at the time. So we did issue, while I was with the group, a discussion paper in 2017, which was really focused on the concept of direct linkage and how to mitigate human rights impacts in that context, and what due diligence really should look like where there is a direct link. The paper, I think it's fair to say, was not particularly well received. I think there was an impression from many stakeholders that it was the banks really trying just to narrow their exposure in the context of the UN guiding principles. Honestly, that wasn't the motivation. The motivation really was to take a key component of the UN guiding principles and explore it and try and add some practical guidance to it. But I can see, and I think we could all see, with the benefit of hindsight, that perhaps that was not how it was conveyed or taken from stakeholders. But what was important, I think, is that the paper was produced very firmly with dialogue in mind. The Thun Group wanted to draft something. I think we were the first sectoral group to produce something of that nature, to try and grapple with the practical realities of the guiding principles. And then that was set to be a basis for discussion and dialogue. And so although it wasn't a particularly well-received paper at the outset, what it did do was engender a really constructive discussion. So in 2017 at the Thun Group annual conference, we had many stakeholders, including Professor Ruggie, come along, and we had some very active debate and discussion. that led to some clarifications from the Thun Group in a follow-up paper. And I think made us all very mindful of, going forwards, what impact our outputs can have and how we need to be very thoughtful about the way these things are put together. But I think I would say that the exercise was a success insofar it was meaningful engagement, including with stakeholders, to try and map out some of these issues and grapple with the difficulties of the guiding principles in practice. Moving on from that, the group has certainly grown. So I think we're now at 14 participating banks. I think we were 7 at the original discussion paper. And in terms of the work that we do, there are a number of work streams across the Thun Group at the moment. Raoul will speak to some of them in a moment, but certainly there's a lot of, we're thinking quite carefully about the overlay with compliance, with financial crime, and how business and human rights and financial crime, there are sort of inherent synergies there that could be opportunities for collaboration, for crossover work within the banks. And we spend a lot of time on training and internal knowledge sharing of ideas, education. Again, there is so much in the business and human rights space, let alone ESG, that the banks are grappling with. And indeed, these individuals from the banks are trying to navigate in their day-to-day roles, that the more we can share ideas and educate within the group, the better. So that's certainly a focus. And then thirdly, and perhaps passing to Raoul, that there's a lot of careful thought around outreach to other financial institutions. So perhaps seamlessly, I will stop there in case Raoul wants to speak to that.
Thanks, Susie. You're making my job very easy indeed. Let's seamlessly transition to Raoul. Raoul, you're leading the communication of the Thun Group, and not just Patrick Gaudier wasn't sure about whether the Thun Group still exists, but I would say it's probably one of the best kept secrets of the sustainable finance field. And so let me tell us why you think this perception exists and if there are any plans to change this in the future. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I don't know if the Thun Group is the best kept secret. So as Christian said, so it started in 2011, and then a few discussion papers were published. It is true that in the last years we haven't publish such discussion papers. What we do, and that's something you can find on the internet, is to publish summaries of our discussions at the annual Thun Group meeting. So that's something you can find on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, for example. But I think it's true that in the last years, I would say, the focus has been on what Susie mentioned, also on having a dialogue between banks, really exchanging among practitioners, I would say, on how to operationalize the UN guiding principles. I think actually what the Thun Group does is not different from what other sectors do. As Christian said, the UN guiding principles apply to all sectors, and you have other sectors that do something similar as what we do at Thun. Maybe something relevant here for Geneva, the commodity trading sector that published this guidance document, I believe in 2018, really clarifying or putting into practical terms what the UNGPs mean for them. So that's what we try to do at the Thun Group. Just as a side note, maybe this guidance being done by other sectors, for example, by the commodity trade sector, is something that is, of course, also important for us as banks, because it clarifies it, or it gives us examples of how the UNGPs are applied by sectors that might be then clients of the bank. I mean, in terms of what we plan, yes, we plan to be, I guess, a bit more visible as a group. I think what we're doing today here at this Building Bridges event, and thanks for having us, is part of it, to have a dialogue. I would say another element is a website. So since a few weeks, we have a website, thungroup.org. So that's also part of that exercise of being more visible. And I would say that in general, we would welcome also other banks to join the Thun Group, so banks that would have an interest in developing guidance, in exchanging among banks. And I think the requirement in general would be that these banks would need to have a public commitment already to the issue of human rights, like a human rights policy. But I would say, and that's maybe my last point, you know, the raison d'être of the Thun Group is still the same. I think it's about knowing that companies and banks have the responsibility to respect human rights. So it's the right thing to do, to work on really practical guidance to implement the UNGPs. I think an idea that was there at the beginning and is still the case today is to act before legislation comes in, so be ready for new legislation coming in this field. And we've seen legislation in different jurisdictions, in France, the loi de devoir de vigilance, or the initiative we had here in Switzerland on responsible companies. And the Thun Group has really allowed banks, I think, to be, the members to be ready for this new legislation that has come up and will continue, in my view, to develop. And in general, I would say that something that was also there at the beginning and still there, I think, the idea of acting together as banks. So we know that banks will have to implement the UNGPs on their own at their banks, but this idea of having this collective thinking exercise and really exchanging best practice is something that we had at the beginning and still have today.
Thank you, Raul. Direct follow-up question. So you mentioned the guidance for the commodity trading sector. That was an exercise that was also supported by the Swiss government and facilitated by the Institute for Human Rights in Business. And I mean, could you imagine developing such a guidance document as well for banks in general? Is that something you could imagine engaging in?
Well, I think the Thun Group, as Susie mentioned, did write a few papers on the topic. Here I would say, I think an important group of, working group that builds on the UNGPs is the work done by the OECD on responsible business conduct. And there you have a series of papers, one for institutional investors, one on securities underwriting and corporate lending, so very relevant for the banks. There will be one published probably next year on asset-specific financing. Yeah. So I think that's, maybe I think the Thun Group, the banks of the Thun Group might also be part of the working groups at the OECD. That's the case for Credit Suisse. So I don't know if we're going to publish a new paper, because you have other organizations that are doing that, building on the UNGPs.
Okay. Thanks. Since we're talking about publications, I'll also use this for shameless self-promotion, because we published today a case study on how banks can engage with sustainable finance from a human rights perspective. It's available on our website, and it focuses on ABN AMRO's engagement strategy with their palm oil producers in Indonesia, because it's in our interest, the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, to highlight ways how human rights can become central to business decisions in banks. How can they become part of the core? And this is a way how ABN AMRO proves that they can actually have influence over working conditions in palm oil plantations through a client and their lending practices, in this case, Wilmar. And I think it's an interesting example, probably a best practice example that deserves highlighting. And I'd be keen to hear about more interesting and positive and pioneering strategies for how banks implement human rights in very concrete terms. But let me stay with you for a brief moment, Raul. Tell me, what are the key challenges? Which areas do you think the banking sector needs to focus on in particular to meet that commitment to human rights? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No.
You can continue, Christian, in a moment, and Susie.
No, I would say, what banks need to focus on, I think it builds a bit on what I said before. I think it's really to make sure that they are working on these practical steps to integrate the UNGPs into their practices. So this means, well, being part of the Thun Group, for example, or contributing to developing new guidance by the OECD, like these guidance documents that I mentioned. And then, so I would say this is the first step. Then what needs to happen within a bank is that you then need to integrate this guidance into the practices directly of the bank. And that's maybe the most challenging part. But I think it's really about seeing what are the processes that you have within the bank, the risk processes. It can be a KYC process, or your reputational risk process, your risk country process, your PEP, politically exposed persons process, and really making sure that these human rights risks elements are integrated within the bank. Of course, keeping in mind, and that's something that you find in the UNGPs, that when you are integrating these into your risk management processes, what you need to keep in mind is that you're talking of risk to right holders, right? Not to the risk to the bank, even though those often overlap. When there are risks for right holders, these in many cases present risk for the client and in turn for the bank.
I think I want to ask the same question to you, Christian. Where do you see the greatest challenges, or do you have concrete examples to highlight what has changed in concrete terms at UBS since these discussions at the Thun Group? Because I know you're also advocating for moving beyond the UN guiding principles. So what does this mean in concrete terms?
I mean, I think if you put it in historical terms, I mean, let's remember, 2011, the UNGPs, then we had 2015, Mark Carney's Tragedy of Horizon speech, which gave us basically kicked off the whole discussion that led to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and 1st of January 2016, the SDGs, So, or if you look at it from a different angle, we had a tool built back in 2013, to capture regulatory developments, and I'm sure Susie will be able to comment on the developments. And honestly, when I look back at 2014, and we had this kind of in the tool, there's this kind of red flag what people look from Outlook, like this red flag system, and the red flag tells you, okay, you haven't read this particular development yet. And it used to be kind of easy at the beginning, It's completely not possible anymore, I don't think, for a single person, unless they do this day and night, to capture what's going on in the regulatory space around sustainability topics. I mean, as one of my dear colleagues, long-standing colleagues at UBS, said repeatedly says, he's never in his whole career, and he's done regulatory stuff for decades, seen anything developing so quickly. And so when you go back to the UNGPs, I mean, the next big thing was probably the EU NFRD in 2014, but that's peanuts. Sorry to quote somebody who recently died. That's kind of peanuts compared to what we see now. So I think the landscape has changed completely and massively, which is number one. And the second one is the UNGPs, of course, are essentially focused on the do no harm approach, which is quite right, and that's what they're there for. That's what John Ruggie and his team were asked to develop, Now, of course, when you look at it from today's perspective, then the discussion, and that's why Building Bridges is a sustainable finance conference, is a much broader one. It's not about just the do no harm and that side of things. So when I look at it that, so clearly the human rights aspect is embedded in the SDGs. It's actually interesting that, of course, as probably all of you know, there is no actual SDG around human rights. So it's all around that. And so therefore, exactly. So so therefore there is a discussion now how, and that's been, of course, been evolving since. How do you look at human rights across the board, So when I look at it from our perspectives, in terms of focusing on something like the SDGs, yes, there is that identification of potential adverse impacts, that's related to the UNGPs very directly. But then, of course, it's all about what are the ways and means, to deal with it from an investment perspective, for instance, from a financing perspective, What are ways and means to actually move the needle on human rights, not solely from a do no harm perspective, And I think that's a very critical question. And so, our asset management, for instance, is looking at that through all their investment approaches, through their engagement approach and so on. That would be one example. Impact investing is another one, Now, to be provocative, and we can come back to that later on, the interesting thing that I find is, particularly when you look at it from an impact investing perspective, nobody actually ever uses the word human rights, People use words like health, education. Well, I don't think they ever will. I mean, maybe we can discuss this later on, I don't think that's the challenge. I don't think people look at it in the same way that they look at climate. Nobody, we can discuss that. Nobody has any problems with looking at climate from a risk and opportunity perspective, because that's what it really is. People talk about climate risks, and people look at climate opportunities. I don't know, how many people do you know who talk about human rights opportunities? Well, yes, okay, exception. But the point is that when people look at it from a product perspective, they use different terms, which is kind of an interesting one, and worth discussing. When you look at the whole way that climate has just become this dominant topic, in the minds of every stakeholder out there, every regulator, everything that's happening, COP26, whatever, where is the similar one around human rights? And to add another one, and as a challenge, even though there are, of course, now discussions around mandatory due diligence around human rights, the landscape currently is completely all over the place. So you have modern slavery statements, or acts. You have loi de vigilance, as you mentioned. You have discussions around child labor. You have the Swiss, the part of the counter proposal, which is child labor and conflict minerals. So there isn't anything out there that looks at it in the way that people look at climate. And then say, okay, here's the TCFD, that's the framework, that's what we want. FINMA tells us that, we want that. We want TCFD, for the banking sector and the financial sector. And I think that's the sort of landscape that we are faced with now in terms of what do we do with that in the human rights space, Because at the end of the day, you cannot get to where we want to get by solely, I'm deliberately provocative, solely looking at it through a do no harm lens. And I think we're going to end up at a point, and then it's not going to go beyond. And I think that's the kind of challenge that we see now. Actually, very practically, another challenge is that at least, and Raul, you can jump in here, but when I look at across all the people that I know, and I know a lot of people at banks, I think it feels to me like 150% of their time is spent on climate. That was completely different 10 years ago. And so again, what does that mean in terms of key practitioners being also completely focused on that, because there's almost no way around it today, not to look at that topic. So there are some interesting, and I'll just put this out there provocatively. I think there are some interesting developments which I don't think people foresaw, 10 years ago, which we're really faced with. Today. And just the last comment that I say that people foresaw because I'm a historian, and one thing historians do, they rarely try to predict the future unless they're Neil Ferguson, but that's another one.
Thank you, Christian. I think you make a really important point of also exploring the opportunity space in the human rights context, not just the risk, which is sort of historically the expertise of human rights advocacy groups. Yet, certainly at the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights, we're trying to figure out how business models can align with a commitment to human rights, yet also focus on profits. It's no contradiction necessarily. But you and Raul now mentioned those rapidly developing legislations at the European level, but also at the national level. And now I want to come back to Susie and let her explain a bit how this patchwork landscape of regulation is currently driving the work. You're at a law firm, so I'm sure you get a lot of questions about that, but also how do banks deal with that? You mentioned the loi de vigilance in France, there's the supply chain law now in Germany, there was a votation here in Switzerland, and certainly I think the European level will be decisive here. There's already the non-financial reporting initiative, there's the EU taxonomy, and maybe in the next few days at the UN forum, apparently Surya Deva, one of the members of the UN working groups, said he hopes that the EU law on mandatory human rights due diligence will be a Christmas present, so it's expected any time soon now. So there's a lot going on. So how are you navigating this complicated landscape with your clients and also in the context of the Thun Group?
Yeah, I mean, you've summarized that very well, because there is a real challenge for clients in, and banks, if we stick to financial services for a moment, these are global institutions. So they are operating multiple jurisdictions, cross-border. And the challenge, well, one of the many challenges is trying to find some sense of uniformity to implement the right systems and controls to manage these risks and to, also to seek out opportunities where you have a sort of patchwork of and no uniformity across different jurisdictions in terms of the standards expected and the what risks you are truly managing. So that is a challenge. I think the European Commission initiative, when we see it, may well, I mean, it's lauded in many ways as potentially bringing some uniformity, at least across Europe. But that is obviously in one particular context around mandatory due diligence. And as you say, the business and human rights space in terms of legislation is vast, and mandatory due diligence is a critical part of that, but it's not the only part. We see a lot of different legislative standards and regulatory requirements around reporting and disclosure. And then, of course, you have now emerging standards around taxonomy and classification of products and how that's all being managed and considered, as well as the due diligence piece. So it's definitely a challenge. And I think one, the resourcing within banks, I'm not sure has grown to meet that challenge in the same way, because often the same individuals who sort of 10 years ago were managing these kinds of topics are still the same, and yet the sort of volume of material they're trying to navigate and marshal has grown exponentially. So I think there's definitely a resourcing challenge there for many banks. In terms of what does that lead to? I suppose before answering that question, I think it's also important to have in mind that legislation is but one of the main drivers here, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, Dora. So you have, I mean, the regulatory interest and regulatory scrutiny, I think, is a huge driver of focus and change, especially at senior levels within financial institutions and indeed any other corporate. When the regulators, the level of scrutiny of regulators increases, I think one often sees then a corresponding increase of focus at senior levels of management. And at the same time, although we haven't seen as much in the litigation space against financial services institutions, certainly more generally in business and human rights, that we are seeing some really important decisions and quite seminal decisions coming through the pipeline. And I think that will increasingly have an impact on banks' managements and how banks are considering their own positions in how they're addressing human rights risks. Also, national contact point complaints and outcomes. We've seen, as an example, very recently, ANZ come out with an announced grievance mechanism. That's the first bank to do so. Now, that is directly related to the outcome of a national contact point finding, where ANZ was encouraged to change policy and to embrace a grievance mechanism. So that's a direct connection through to the complaints mechanism that's in place there. And then, of course, you've got investor pressure and shareholder activism, which are another key driver. So I appreciate that's not answering your question, but I think legislation is really important. And definitely as we see this sort of galvanizing of standards into hard law, you can't deny that has a huge impact. But I think it must be seen in the round alongside these other drivers. And in terms of what that then translates into, well, I agree with Christian. I mean, climate change has always been sort of number one focus, but we are seeing business and human rights gaining more traction internally, and more focus of sort of senior management at board level on these issues, which, as I say, well, probably derived from all of these factors, but certainly I would say regulators having a key role there. And then, as Christian said, then you've also seeing the banks really turning their minds to what the positive opportunities are here. So it can't and shouldn't be just a matter of risk management. There are really positive steps the banks can take and products they can offer. And certainly there's investor demand for that. So I think that's another area of focus.
On that investor demand, in this audience, I don't need to explain what ESG is, but I'd love to ask any of you, how does ESG interest help bringing human rights up on the agenda? I mean, the E is on environment. Clearly, we heard from you the climate discussion dominates it all. Governance is fairly well regulated. The S is, I think, the least well explored and defined portion of ESG. Does ESG and the growing interest in ESG help the human rights agenda? Who wants to comment?
I mean, maybe just, I mean, I've always been a great fan of putting the G first, you know. I think ESG is a bit of a misnomer, you know, because the one that's been really around longest is the G, you know. And I don't think if any company that gets the G wrong probably has no chance with the E and S, let's be clear, you know. If you don't get your G right, you know, I mean, who am I to say, you know, working for a bank that had a few experiences, you know, with G, you know. So anyway, it's an interesting one, you know. So, then you have E. I think E, of course, today seems like it's all climate, you know. Now, climate has the major advantage, you know, despite all the discussions that you have around methane and so on with COP26, it's still one KPI, and that's called CO2. People can break it down to CO2, and they can quantify it, and that's a thing that we like at banks, you know. You can actually quantify something, and you can quantify your risk, and you can quantify your opportunities, you know. And then you're with the S. And when you talk to actually shareholders and analysts, then I'd say the one S, in inverted commas, that's sort of at foremost in their minds is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. You know, they rarely talk about human rights actually, but they talk a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion. You know, so you know, you could say, okay, we're talking at the end still about human rights, but again, I think, you know, as somebody who's very keen on language, I always find this very interesting, what terms people use or what terms they don't use. You know, and what does that tell us? You know, about you know, how they're thinking about a particular one, because they always talk about climate, you know, there's no doubt, you know, but when you go to the S, it becomes a bit more, interesting. So I think the challenge with the S is, at the end of the day, that it's a lot more difficult to quantify, you know. I mean, there are parts that you can, but it's just not as straightforward as it is with the E, you know, and I think that's, of course, not helped the discussion. It's still, you know, kind of a challenge today. And now, of course, we see interesting developments in how, and of course it's never been separate, you know, that's an artificial divide, is of course how they kind of interact, you know, how they're interlinked, you know, and how people look at it a bit more in interlinked fashion. You know, but I still think, you know, there is quite a lot of work that still needs to be done to put S onto the same level, even though it says ESG. If you put it as in a height, it would be the smallest of the three, no doubt, you know.
No, maybe building on what Christian said, I think maybe from a risk management perspective, and that's what my work is at Credit Suisse mostly, I think you know, there's a strong overlap in any case on especially I would say on the E and the S, and at least in my work, I think you need to take a holistic approach, and the E and the S very much go together if you think of you know, because of the E or climate change, sectors that might be suffering in the future, typically the fossil fuel sector, and what this will mean for people working in these sectors. Well, there you see the connection with the concept of just transition or impact on these workers. Another example would be, the type of minerals needed for the transition to a low carbon economy, to building batteries. So cobalt, copper, minerals that you tend to find to a large extent in developing countries that you need to mine, and the questions this asks in terms of human rights. Risks at these operations. And then maybe on the other big topic under biodiversity, with the COP on the Convention on Biological Diversity that just took place, the first part, the next part taking place next year. There again, you see this overlap. When you have a pollution event or deforestation, this tends to have impact on communities living there. So I would say that there's, at least in my work, you cannot really differentiate at least the E and the S.
I think that's a fantastic conclusion by arguing, well, actually it's an artificial separation, you called it, and in your work it's intersecting, overlapping anyway, because indeed, if you look at it, the environment and social dimensions of sustainability are inextricably linked and could also be dealt with in parallel. So with that, I also see an invitation to everyone here, and certainly also to academia, to work on the quantification of the S in ESG to make this easier to take on and implement. I want to now, in this last cluster, look ahead and see, where do we go from here? I think we've done an assessment of what the Thun Group does, where the banking sector stands right now. But let me get to you, Susie, and come back to your assessment of how do you see the area of banking and human rights evolve in the next decade? We talked about the legislation, but also the many other drivers that will shape this field. But how do you plan to advance this field through the Thun Group as well? So what are your future plans?
In terms of what the landscape will look like, maybe I'll take that in two parts. So in terms of the external landscape, I think you're quite right. And as discussed among this group, we will definitely see proliferation of hard law, whether that's through the mandatory human rights due diligence directive, which, as we know, we're waiting for, or other hard law, or indeed just emboldening of existing law. So, for example, in the UK, we have a Modern Slavery Act. We have reporting requirements attached to that, but they are seen as lacking teeth. And the UK government has, on a number of occasions, promised us more robust legislation in that regard. So I think we will see further legislation around that. At the same time, certainly with things like the European Mandatory Due Diligence Directive, once we see that come through, inevitably there will also need to be accompanying guidance and scrutiny of what it means in practice and how one translates it, especially given what could be quite significant implications in terms of corporate liability. So to the extent that we see a hard law come through the pipeline, I think it's inevitable that will have to be accompanied by quite a lot of soft law guidance, standards, criteria that will inform and help businesses grapple and implement effectively whatever standards are put in place. I think we'll also see a growth of regulatory interest in this space. We're already seeing that come through, certainly in the UK, with focus on greenwashing risk, pinkwashing risk, however you frame those risks, and also on climate change disclosures, which, as discussed, sit separately, but there are, of course, connections in with human rights. And then I think we will also see, as a corollary of some of these developments, increasing, and I would say this because I'm a litigator, but increasing court focus on these issues and recourse to the courts. So the NCP route, the sort of grievance mechanism route through the OECD guidelines, is already actually quite heavily used for banks. It's about banks, I think, are the second most, have either been the leading or second leading sector in NCP complaints for some time. But I think we will continue to see that, but also see more coming through the courts. So I think banks will need to be ready for that. And then internally, in terms of what does that mean for the coming years, I think banks will need, I mean, are already starting to do this, and I speak of banks generally, not just with the Thun Group members, but there will need to be expanded resourcing, expanded attention on these issues. It will become critical for those who have not already done so to really centralize consideration of these issues within the bank. So you're not looking at these issues in silos across compliance or legal or sales and marketing even. There needs to be some cohesion across the organizations for these issues. And I know many banks are already considering that actively, and those who haven't done so, I think will need to do so imminently. So I shall pause there.
Your last point is great, because you're already pointing out to do this effectively, you need to break down departmental silos and connect the dots and work together. But I also enjoyed your statement that the emergence of hard law won't replace the necessity of soft law engagement. And that's what the Thun Group is essentially doing. I mean, you're trying to define in concrete terms what does human rights due diligence mean, and as it becomes mandatory by law, I think this work will become even more important than ever. I know you, Christian, are not exactly energized by the UNGP +10 agenda. How can we energize it? How can the Thun Group help?
I think we've moved from, I mean, I used the word at the beginning, when we started off, it was about really interpreting, the UNGPs, for the banking sector. I think now the word that I would use, and also looking at what Raoul said and what Susie said, is the word navigate rather than interpret, because it really becomes like a navigating exercise, And I think, you look at it from a broader sustainability perspective. When you go back in banks, 1970s and 80s, a lot of them would have looked at their own, like our bank would have looked at their own, what they do within their own operations. You had your first sort of energy efficiency approaches and so on. Then the 2000s, you could see, what Raoul referred to. In the first instance, this whole environmental risk management emerging, then human rights came part of that, and we started those discussions, and banks, like Raoul said, brought that together. Then you saw with the SDGs, that of course there is a more and more focus on the opportunities. I mean, we brought out a paper in 2015, how to make the SDGs investable, and I always remember that, because it's like, okay, how do you translate that one into opportunities? But now I think in the 2020s, and it's really slapdash kind of decades, it is really a jungle, I mean, in terms of, you notice that and in a number of ways. I mean, when we had the first Thun Group meeting in 2011, we had one lawyer in the entire room, There are a few more now, as Susie knows. There are now, when I look at our own bank, we have people within the bank that would never have looked at sustainability, particularly also from our compliance department, let alone legal, that look at this more and more, So this is really changing rapidly.
Is it helping or hindering?
The jury, I mean, as a historian, I probably have to say the jury is still out, I don't know, it's, no, but... It's just, I don't think it's helping or hindering is the right question. It's just the landscape has changed quite massively, and it's changed within such a short period of time, and it's going to change even more rapidly over the coming years. And so, in a sense, we're moving to your question. We're moving out of a space where we had, I call a bit like, I'm not into ice dance, but if you think about ice dance, there is this piece where you can do things very freely, free dance or whatever, and then there's the duty, and freestyle, exactly, and sustainability used to be this kind of freestyle space, we could create stuff, that's becoming smaller and smaller, and it's that other part, that you have to do that, where the umpires will say, okay, this one you need to do exactly by that. It's just becoming the bigger one, and so I can't say whether it's helping or hindering. That's a very subjective one, depending on what you want to achieve, at the end of the day, it is a changed landscape, and we'll have to work with that changed landscape. I think it's more a question, and this is why I looked at your point about the UNGP, my comment about the UNGP's 10+, is because there's a section there on outcomes, and I'm just not convinced that section really captures, where we really need to go. But it's exactly that, what kind of outcomes
What
do we want to see,
achieve?
exactly,
Yeah,
and I think that's a really interesting question. And if you ask different stakeholders, regulators, whatever, they probably give you different answers, to what they would see as an outcome, And that is a very different landscape to when we said 10 years ago, okay, let's make sure the UNGPs are embedded in our bank, Now, that's one sentence, it's just, it's not enough anymore,
No, indeed. This and to all of you, let's conclude with a feel-good round of where do you see the greatest achievements of the Thun Group to date? What have you, looking back 10 years, looking ahead 10 years, you want to build on what you've achieved so far, you've strengthened your group, but where do you see sort of the most important building blocks from the past 10 years that will be necessary for the next 10 years? And then I want to open up to you and your questions.
Maybe briefly. No, I think, and I think I partly already said that, but so Thun Group was created in 2011, and it was about understanding how what the UNGPs mean in practical terms for banks. And as I said, also one of the objectives there was to be prepared for new regulation that would come, and that has come in the meantime. And then also, I would say, be a place where banks can discuss and then also influence, and I think it has influenced the work of the Thun Group, influence what has been done, for example, by the OECD working group on responsible business conduct. Yeah, so looking ahead, I think the role of the Thun Group will not change much. It will be about, I think what Christian said, navigating probably in this jungle of legislation. But I think the idea is still the same. It's either soft law as it used to be, or hard law as we have now, and will be more and more be so. It's about understanding how to then turn the soft law or hard law into practice, and to integrate that in your risk management processes, for example.
So the actual implementation in individual companies' risk management processes.
Yeah, I mean that's my focus.
Measurable impact.
Yeah.
Outcome. No. Can we track that?
I guess. Yeah, I mean, it's well, as Christian said, I think a challenge with human rights is that you don't have this unit of measure as you would have, for example, with climate. So it's more difficult to measure, but and risk avoidance, it is also difficult to measure. Is it because you're not financing a certain project? What is the impact you're avoiding for the right holders or for the bank? So it's difficult to measure, but that's maybe something for the future, having KPIs or something that can be a bit more measurable. It's a challenge.
I mean, maybe an interesting one in that respect. What we've sort of disclosed for many years, it's how many assessments our environmental social risk unit does on environmental and human rights and related topics. So we show very clearly in our sustainability report every year they've done so and so many assessments, probably 2,000. I can't remember what was the last number. And then it says, how many were accepted, how many were accepted with conditions, and how many were denied or not done. And the interesting thing is, because that last number is very small, but it's actually the result of exactly what Raoul said, which is that it's been the topic's been so embedded in the company. And I remember conversations even 15 years ago, where people would say to me, "Yeah, what's that got to do with the bank? Human rights. It was very remote. So now we have a situation, and that's exactly, what I'm sure what Raoul means with that kind of embedding, is where, risk management being, to use the official term, second line of defense, and where the first line of defense, which is really those people, the people that actually are client-facing, that have the client interactions directly, that they are at a point now where they take the decision, They know, okay, this is not the kind of transaction that for environmental and or human rights reasons we should do. So it actually would never appear in the number that I've highlighted, because it's already not done before it even gets to people like Raoul, And I think that is a massive step, I mean, looking at the conversations we had, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure, my colleagues from Credit Suisse would say the same. Even a few years ago, it's changed massively. There's a completely different understanding in how the relevance of this. I mean, we've taken a step where we've basically integrated it a good number of years ago into the same tool within UBS that looks at, potential terrorists or money launderers or whatever criminal. So it's at the same level, whether it's an potentially environmental violation or a human rights violation, then it would be in the traditional, let's say, combating financial crime aspect. And I think that's a substantial change to what we used to have. Now, having said that, and I just want to quote, because you mentioned Anita Ramasastry, just quoting Anita from, when the UN forum, I think the last one before Corona hit, she sort of looked at, we were a few Thun Group members sitting in that room in the discussions, and he said, well, we're not talking about you, because we know you are working on this stuff, but there's so many out there that are not, and I think we want to send a message to them, and I think that's what, of course, they've done, in terms of that latest 10+ paper. There is, of course, a section there on the financial sector. So I think, to me, that's why, in terms of best kept secret, I think, because at the end of the day, that has been the critical piece for us, is how do we move the needle within our banks? We had bank representatives that came to meetings and they really wanted to know, okay, so how am I going to convince my senior management that this is important, That's a conversation you've got to have, because I think a lot of people, that's the G for me, by the way. A lot of people do not understand how important it is to really work within and with the governance that you have within a bank. And it's not surprising to me, which is why I like the framework a lot, is that TCFD starts with governance. It doesn't start with strategy, it starts with governance. It doesn't start with risk management, it starts with governance, And I think there's a good reason for that, because if you get that one wrong, then, if you don't manage to embed it right up to the highest level of your firm, be it risks, be it on the opportunity side, then you already have a problem,
Christian, Susie, your thoughts?
So, well, I mean, obviously I agree with everything Christian just said, but are we answering the question still around what the sort of successes have been for the two groups? That's
yes,
the question.
Major achievements, and Christian highlighted the embeddedness of this topic, and organizational structures at individual banks was one key point.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both Raoul and Christian have said, in that obviously we have issued papers and so on in the past, but I think where the value has really landed is, and it's repeating really what's been said, but where banks are positioning themselves, informed by those discussions, informed by the education aspects, and informed by the exchanging of ideas around best practice. So I think it's sort of manifesting in the performance of each bank rather than some sort of outward work product as it stands. That's really been where the value has crystallized.
Now, over to you. I'm sure there are many experts in the room and many more questions. Let's start right here in the middle, and then we walk our way backwards.
Thank you very much. I'm Manny Ryback with Credit Suisse. And first of all, thank you very much to the organizers and for the panel to actually have this panel on this important topic. Two questions, maybe, if I may. First, sort of, on the Thun Group and the membership of the Thun Group. I should probably know the answer, but maybe the others in the room don't know either. You mentioned it currently stands at 14. I'd be curious to know whether there's any non-European, non-American banks that have joined over the years. If not, if you can say something about the business and human rights dialogue at non-European, non-American banks, how this is sort of has evolved over the years, if you know. And then the second question may be directed at Susie. You made a comment that I thought was quite interesting. You said, and I would agree with this, looking at the climate change litigation space and how that has evolved, that more human rights litigation is to be expected. And in that context, you mentioned the OECD NCPs, where banks have been very much sort of at the forefront also, as you rightly also said. Do you think that potential human rights litigation would then replace sort of where civil society goes to, so i.e. replace the NCP proceedings, or would it just be on top of it? So we would continue to have a lot of OECD NCP proceedings, and then on top of it, as we see in the climate litigation space, human rights litigation. Thank you.
Very quickly on the first one, it started off heavily European headquartered focus, and it still is European headquartered focus. Though having said that, of course, I mean, a bank like UBS is in 50 jurisdictions. I mean, Credit Suisse, I can't remember. You know, Raoul. Standard Chartered, HSBC. I mean, these are banks, of course, who have footprints all around the globe. But if you're looking just at the head office, then it's very heavily, Europe based. And I think it's an interesting one. We do have interactions with, for instance, US headquartered institutions. I mean, I don't want to go into politics. It's not, human rights is always politics. But I think there's some interesting observations around that. I think my key concern is really, and I'd like to, not that I can give the answer, but it's really the point, Anita, that I quoted early on. It's what's happening. It's what's happening at other institutions in other parts of the, or headquartered in other parts of the world. And I wonder at this point, and I can only wonder because I just have no evidence, is whether, again, the climate topic has just taken over so much that this human rights discussion has moved into the background, when it used to be maybe a bit more in the foreground. I mean, that's just an assumption. We'll see how it pans out over the coming years. Actually also alongside, we talk about mandatory due diligence, there is also supposed to be a social taxonomy, I mean, to come. Yeah. And there's actually not just in Europe, because at the moment, I think there are 17 countries with sustainable finance taxonomies either planned or underway, or, including Mongolia, Russia, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting question will be, what will the social part of those, wherever it exists, it doesn't exist in all of those, what that will mean.
Would like Raoul to take it? Okay.
Or Susie, I think was directed.
Susie?
Yeah, do you want me to take the NCP question, or are you still answering the first one? I can wait.
The first one still, or? Yeah.
Maybe on the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really an answer to the question directly, but maybe something I would mention here. I was 2 weeks ago at the Equator Principles annual meeting, and there you have over 100 banks that are members, and the biggest growth over the last years has come from the APAC region. And so I think that's another important forum, and something you can find also in the summary of the AGM, which is public. The AGM that happened 2 weeks ago is the focus on human rights, actually, and on the topic of grievance mechanism, access to remedy, so Pillar 3, having functioning grievance mechanism for project-specific financings. So I think that's maybe where you see non-European, non-US banks getting involved in the human rights topic.
Maybe just then turning to the second part of the question around NCPs and litigation. I mean, perhaps before answering it, just going back to the context around why NCPs have been so popular. I think the challenge has always been in litigation context for any claim against a bank, the question of standing, because to pursue a case around negligence or under tort law, you need to show a duty of care. And of course, the banks by definition are one step removed from any sort of client relationship. Whereas NCPs, I think, have been seen as a viable route where you can also have really meaningful outcome and remediation or change of policy, for example. I think if things like the legal hook for litigation that's envisaged by the European directive is effective, or seen as effective, and if the claimant bar rises to meet that or leans into that avenue for litigation, you may well see the amount of NCP complaints drop off. But I mean, what I've often heard from civil society is that actually litigation is very often not really in the interests of the underlying victims of human rights impacts. You know, they have to wait for many years. Financial compensation is really not the main goal. It might be something that's obviously welcome, but actually the main goal is to get the change of policy, to get the passport back if there's a forced labour issue, to change working conditions. And if those could be achieved more readily and without the toll that inevitably takes to go through litigation, then actually NCP is the preferred route. So I think it's in the balance at the moment, but certainly if the directive that we're envisaging comes through, and if it does lay out this sort of route map for corporate liability, we may well see that what would otherwise have gone to a NCP is redirected into a litigation route. So I don't know if that completely answers your question. I think it remains to be seen, but certainly litigation may well not be the answer for all complainants, because damages may not really be the remedy that's most prized in that scenario.
Thanks, Susie. That was a thumbs up. I'm not sure if you saw that, so a question answered. So now next is Sandrine. No, sorry, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Anne Glore from Nexus Vesting. Let's suppose I'm a new client of yours. Do you hear me with this mask on? Okay. I'm a new client of yours, so I'm speaking to the bankers, and I'm the director of a foundation. I have 50 million to invest, and my foundation is promoting human rights. So I have a capital to invest, and I want this capital not to go into companies that have a bad human rights track record, because that would be against my mission to do that. And also I know that human rights violation is a risky, costly business, so it's also from a financial standpoint not very wise to invest in these companies. And then I'm a little bit more ambitious, I would say. I actually not only want you to avoid the bad ones, but I want you to pick the good ones, in the sense that those who really explicitly respect human rights and even ideally promote human rights. Do you know how to find out what kind of companies correspond to my ideal? And do you even have maybe financial products like funds, thematic funds on human rights? What's your response to me as your new client? And if I may just maybe add one comment, I think many honest bankers would say, sorry, I can't help you. But I hope you have a response to this, which is different. Often there's this question of, I have heard this so often from people working at banks, there's no market. We don't have clients asking for these kind of things. And however, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because especially people working for foundations, but also maybe, family offices, if it's not something you offer, they're not going to ask for it. But however, as someone active in the foundation world, if there was a human rights screening available, that goes beyond ESG screening, who would say no to that? We even are aware nowadays that financially it's not less interesting, even though the universe is smaller, but you have actually good checking. It's an additional instrument to find out which are the good companies that in a longer perspective also perform better than others. So do you really think there's no market for this, if that's what you think? Or what's your perspective on that? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great concrete question. Sorry for mixing you up with someone else. It's the mask. Sorry.
I think, first of all, and that probably would feed into Raoul's work and others at the firm, we would do a due diligence on you, because we're not sure whether we're going to have you as a client, that would be number one. Because so just to be clear, foundations go through a very strict due diligence process, in terms of what they have as a track record in terms of their environmental and human rights performance, So I think that's just number one, because it's been always critical to do that. The second one is there are opportunities to screen. I mean, screening is not an issue. You can do screening anytime. The question is exclusion the answer? That's the key question. I mean, for instance, one of our most successful, and it's not human rights, but it's climate. So again, we're back to that challenge. Product is, and strategy is actually not just a product, it's a strategy because it's active, passive, it's across the board, is, on a climate topic, overweighting in a fund, for instance, companies that have a very good performance when it comes to climate and underweighting those that have a not so good performance, and combining that with an engagement program to essentially ensure that the underweighted ones improve over time, rather than just say we don't want them. So that would be the climate equivalent. I don't think, to your question, we're that far yet on the as banks with the human rights topic, because again, it's easier to quantify the climate topic. But I think it's obviously possible to do the screening, depending on what the requirements are of the particular client, because that can vary. It's possible to do investments that have a human rights angle. I mean, again, it comes back to my earlier question. What are we talking about? I mean, one of our most successful recent products. In a substantial way was our oncology impact fund, Right to Health. That's been massively oversubscribed. So I think this actually also tells us. I don't know whether people will automatically think of health, but I personally very much think of health, when I think of human rights. So in a sense, there are clearly products, that people can invest in, to ensure that that moves the needle on the human rights topic. If you're asking whether we are, anywhere close to what we are on environmental topics, I'd have to say no. I think that there is more available on the environmental and climate side than there is on the human rights specific side. But I think there have been really moves into the right direction. We also have opportunities. We develop these development impact bonds. They're around maternal health. They're around education. So there are really a range of products that weren't there 4 or 5 years ago, which really give a much greater opportunity to do the kind of investments that have a human rights focus. I think that's the scale of things in the way that we would be looking at it.
No, so briefly, I would say in terms of market, I think over the last years, I think it's actually a market that I believe has grown a lot, and you see this across banks. I think the offering of products, sustainability related products, has increased. That's one of the biggest, I would say, markets in terms of growth and for such products. And I think also maybe coming back to the topic of mandatory to regulation, you have this regulation on mandatory disclosures, and this is also something that is driving this offering of products, and also something that will offer the transparency needed, I guess, for investors, for this foundation, for example, that you mentioned. Over the next years, the expectation will be, and this is based on EU regulation, that you will have to clearly label your products, either as contributing, for example, to something including the EU taxonomy, so something that would be good for climate, for example, or if it's something that is more that doesn't have these features. So I think that's also something that will at least clarify a bit, or bring a bit more structure to this market, which so far has maybe been a market that has been developing with different methodologies. But this being said, it's definitely a sector that has been growing. That's what I see within the bank and also at other banks.
Thanks, Charles. If I may, before the gentleman in the back gets the word, I want to make a quick academic comment on this, because I hear your pain in, well, it's a growing sector, but right now the screening techniques are rather superficial, I would say, because what is being looked at is human rights policies and whatever companies put out about themselves. So it's the narrative that a bank, for example, puts into their CSR report, which becomes the database for a screening technique. So, and that all needs to be read with a grain of salt, because it's the information that a bank chooses to disclose about themselves. So it's not independently verified. And so the measuring what true outcomes and impacts have been achieved remains very difficult in the human rights space. And so whenever there's a screening exercise, particularly on human rights, I think it remains difficult. We need to do better on defining more meaningful metrics for the S in ESG and assessing the sustainability of companies more rigorously.
Although the impact investing space is exactly about that. It's about measuring both the financial return and the impact of the product. That's why that space is so difficult. Because of course the fund, for instance, comes with a clear promise that you get your traditional financial assessment and you get an assessment regularly, annually, whatever the time frame is, of what the fund has actually done. That's of course the key promise that comes with an impact investing product. Or if you take it from an asset management, not a wealth management, but from an asset management perspective, then that would be the engagement strategy. So when our asset manager does a stewardship report, and they show what kind of engagement have they done on climate, on human rights, and how many votes have they done at shareholder meetings on topics such as climate and so on, which is also actually impact investing, but from an institutional asset manager's perspective. So I think there is clearly more. There is more measurement. I think the challenge is still, let's be clear, human rights is largely still a lot more qualitative than, for instance, a topic like climate. So I think the measurement in itself is a challenge to start off with. But again, to Raoul's point, it's exactly that. If there's one trend that stands out in the regulatory space of the last few years, it's transparency. And of course, that's not just regulators. That's actually also what's happening through shareholders and so on. That put more and more pressure on getting the transparency right. Because without that kind of transparency, we're not going to have the results. We're not going to be able to measure, outcomes. We're not going to be able to offer, to your point, the kind of products that give that kind of evidence, around the component parts of that fund, for instance.
All right, now finally to the gentleman in the back.
Hi.
Please introduce yourself first.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
I'm about to take the mask off to be audible. Okay, thank you. So I'm Philip van Ganegem. I'm a tech entrepreneur and impact investor. First, very small remark. Thank you. Amazing session. It even more clarified to me that human rights should be really central in how we navigate our current sustainability issues related to, obviously, environment and climate. Let alone, I think we wouldn't be here in this kind of environment situation, challenges, if we would have respected the human rights of indigenous people, for example. I think there's so many examples. So thank you for very much clarifying that and the work that you've been doing on this. My question is on a recent, rather recent development. So in Scotland, the New York Stock Exchange and a couple of powerful partners announced that they want to launch a new asset class, the natural asset company as a structure, which would potentially own and manage any big natural asset, including, for example, water, right, or forests. That would be a simpler one. So this is, of course, a development which could have a massive impact on all our human rights. What's your opinion on this development, and how do you see this? Thank you.
Thank you. The first part really made my day. The question I pass on. Thanks. Who wants to take it? Susie or Raoul, or who wants to go first? Let's put it this way.
I think, that's, to me, I mentioned transparency just now. I mean, one of the most amazing developments has been how biodiversity has suddenly moved up the ladder, in such a speed. I mean, when I say move up the ladder, we knew, Pava and Sukta, they did the work on ecosystems 2008, and what that means, financing ecosystems and so on. But I'm not sure how many people listened at the time, Yeah. So it's not new, to your point, It's just suddenly it seems like, people seem to discover things, and suddenly it becomes the big thing. And biodiversity is just, now becomes such a major topic. You mentioned, the COP and then the second half next year. So that, it's definitely, and now we have the task force on natural financial related disclosures, so that's been launched in October, so one of my colleagues is actually a member of that. So there's really a speed, in how this topic is emerging quite rightly, just to be very clear, quite rightly, in the discussions of a whole host of stakeholders, including regulators. The interesting thing is, and maybe, we don't have time, but I'm always trying, and as you've probably noticed, I'm trying to be provocative, but is that going to actually do the opposite and push the human rights topic back? Even though I fully recognize the interlinkages, I don't like to look at these topics individually because they're interlinked. But again, it's going to add another layer into the kind of discussions, an understandable one, So I think it'll be interesting how that pans out over the next years vis-a-vis the human rights discussion. Because what I see now is that people are already saying, biodiversity, that's not bad, that's easier to quantify. Very simply, I can count the trees. That's a bit very simplistic. So to me, this is a bit of an interesting discussion that's going to come. But in terms of the importance of it, absolutely with you. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next even months, around that topic.
Not much to add. No, I think indeed I agree with what Christian said. The topic of biodiversity, that's a topic that over the last 2-3 years has really become more prominent. And I think at least that's the expectation, that the COP that just took place on the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that will have a second part next year, will be the kind of Paris Agreement equivalent that we had for climate a few years ago for the issue of biodiversity, with clear targets being set, for example, in terms of conservation, and that then companies, governments, banks also can then start working with. So I think next year is probably an important year for the topic of biodiversity.
And maybe can I quickly say one thing, because you said you're sort of in the tech sector, one thing I find very interesting is the amount of innovation that goes into this now. This comes also back to your question. I'm always astounded, we've just had this new, project launch called Mangroves 40, and it's like, wow, suddenly, okay, there is a whole thing. And I know, there's been things at Credit Suisse with oceans, ecosystems, and so on. So what I find really cool, and fascinating is how many people now that I would probably, some of these I'm not sure how much interest they had in sustainability even a few years ago, is how much energy they're putting into, doing that job, which is, they don't have to come from a sustainability corner, as long as they develop cool products, that make sense to clients, I don't care, whether they come from a sustainability background or not. And I think a lot more is happening now, and a lot more of that needs to happen, to get us there.
So now we have run out of time, but there are 2 more questions, right? And I want them to be on the record. 3? No. But state your question. We will park responding to after the recording, because it's such a smooth organization here. I don't think we can run over time. So we'll wrap things up, but please mention your questions and then you can clarify maybe bilaterally after the event. So.
Thank you. Anne-Marie Vunier from World Vision International, an NGO.
Yeah.
And I really liked your comment about going further than doing no harm and really investing into human rights. I mean, human rights are very numerous, and we could even say that climate change is part of, I mean, now you have the new human rights to, the right to a healthy environment, which is like a new human right. So we could claim this is a human right. So what do you think it would take to make products? Because we know that they need to be profitable, maybe around education, health. You mentioned one product, but something that would really like make a difference in a country on the system of health, the system of education, and make them interesting for buyers and make it something different than grants, because of course we don't want them to be grants, but to be like products.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Alessandra Giacomello. So thank you, first of all, for your very interesting presentation. My question is, I understand the key question discussed here has been really how to make this social sustainability or human rights assessment, basically, how banks can or other financial institutions can make this. And so the question is, I understand a major driver is standardization. So as Susie was mentioning, standards definitely are a first step to look at this. But also understand there's a lack of resources internally in some organizations. So how this is being done? Is this being done? And also how to quantify? This is also a key question. Are financial institutions trying to develop this internally, or are they perhaps seeking the help of external consultants? Or it's a very practical one. Or is academia helping in this space, and who should do it? How can we really build this assessment, and how can we quantify? Because also, if I may challenge a little bit, I understand quantification is an issue, but actually, yes, we can count trees for the environmental side of things, but what about counting casualties, for example, if we talk about human rights, so talking about human lives, actually. So this is just a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions that are now on the record, which we can clarify maybe afterwards. I want to thank you all for your interest. This has been a really engaging session. I'm so grateful for my panelists here, Susie, Raul, and Christian, for being so open to discussing this sometimes very sensitive topic with this room. And I heard a number of encouraging things. This room certainly agrees that climate and human rights belong together. At the COP, I heard them switching to the terminology of just transition, so away from green transitions to just transition. So I'm glad to see that reflected here. And it's also fantastic that the Thun Group continues its work on defining human rights due diligence. The sector specificity of what that means concretely in practice, I think, still requires significant work. And most importantly, to hear about the embeddedness of these procedures in UBS and Credit Suisse, because I think this is what makes all the difference for the day-to-day business operations and business decisions. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure and fantastic that human rights made it to Building Bridges. Thank you.